Hallo und herzlich willkommen. Hier lernst du alles rund um das Thema Investor Relations, Fundraising und Kapitalmarkt. Mein Name ist Julia Stötzl und ich bin Gründerin und CEO von Investor Relations Beratung Unicorn. Unicorn ist auf einer Mission, Investor Relations für die nächste Generation einzuführen. Das bedeutet ganz konkret die Integration von digitalen Medien wie zum Beispiel LinkedIn, Podcast, Newsletter in die klassische Kapitalmarktarbeit. Mehr Informationen zu Unicorn, aber auch zum Podcast findest du unter unicornconsulting.com. Und jetzt wünsche ich euch viel Spaß beim Zuhören.
So I'm super excited to have with me here today Miriam Partington from Sifted. Sifted is a magazine that is backed by Financial Times, and she is the DACH correspondent at the magazine. She's not only writing about the VC and startup ecosystem, which I find super interesting always to read up on news, but she also writes about the future of work, the human side of organizations, covering topics such as remote work, hiring, compensation, company culture, as well as ethics and tech. So a very warm welcome, Miriam. So glad to have you here with us today.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's dive right in. I mean, as you are kind of, representing a magazine that's discussing about startup and VC scene, maybe give us a little bit of background on yourself and what brought you to where you are today and why you kind of ended up at the moment working for Sifted, which is a super exciting place, and kind of what's your background, if you had something to do with startups before, or how you got into that role that you're in today.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I didn't have any background in startups. Like, I studied literature and philosophy, and I was really certain that I was going to work in theatre, but didn't really go to plan. No, I came to Berlin about 5 years ago without a plan. And at that time, there was a lot of young tech startups that needed English native copywriters to do kind of blogging and website stuff. So I just started working with tech companies on their content strategy and things like that. And meanwhile, I was also doing some freelance writing. So mostly art and culture, and then like a little bit of tech. And then about 2.5 years ago, I kind of got on the radar of Sifted, and they were looking for a Berlin correspondent. So it was kind of like a right place, right time kind of thing.
Nice.
But I think what's quite interesting about the Sifted reporters is that all of us have come from different backgrounds. So none of us are really kind of tech or financy people by trade. You know, we all came from different industries. So I think that's also a bit of a sign of like how kind of present and ubiquitous tech is now, right? Because it's a part of every industry, and it's a part of every conversations. So
Absolutely.
I guess everybody has their own perspective on what's happening.
Very cool. And I think what I also really like about the magazine is that you are really writing it in a very understandable language, if you will. Like, it's not only expert jargon, you know, like you're trying to break down some topics, something like a VSOP topic I once read up on. You're really trying to break this down in very understandable language so everyone can understand it who reads it, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think our editors actually encourage us to do that. And there's still times when I'll submit a piece and then one of my editors will say, okay, what does that thing actually mean? You know? And I think that's also important for us as journalists, right? Like, if you don't understand something, what you're communicating is also not going to be understandable. So I think it's also good training for us to really kind of drill down into this terminology and be like, what is this thing? And is this thing worth mentioning? You know, because I think otherwise we can get caught up in this jargon and no one really knows what we're talking about. So.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's really good. So, I mean, you have obviously been with the magazine in the Berlin startup ecosystem already last year when, you know, markets started to kind of go a little bit more down the rookie side. So just curious to hear from a journalist perspective, how do you look at the current market environment that's not as easy anymore, not as, let's say, shiny anymore as it was like the year before? So how do you look at it from a journalist perspective?
I think what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is that it is a really turbulent time. I think that, of course, there's space for positivity. And I appreciate that VCs, for example, they have to be kind of positive to an extent for their portfolio companies. But I do think there's a sense that the market will get worse before it gets better. You know, like I wrote a piece last week about layoffs that are continuing into 2023. Having spoken to recruiters, you know, they're saying that companies are pausing hiring at the moment. We're going to see a lot more staff being cut. Last week there was 10,000 jobs cut from Microsoft.
Yeah.
So
and today from Google, right? I just saw something on Google as well.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to see these mass job cuts, I think, are going to continue at least into Q1. But also in terms of businesses being founded. In Germany, I've received some data today, which I'm going to write on for this week. But, a fewer businesses were founded last year in Germany, which obviously also is connected to interest rates. And interest rates are maintaining this kind of high level. The Financial Times reported last week, and that obviously affects companies being able to raise money. So I think there is like a lot of factors at play which are really affecting startups at the moment. And I think even VCs are confused. VCs that are kind of open with me say, we don't even know what we're doing. We don't know what bets to take. So it is tough. But I think the positive side is that businesses, will be better in the long run. And that is a bit of a cliche, but it's true because, businesses are having to learn to trim down on excesses and be frugal with spending and do more with less and hire the right people and all that kind of stuff. So I do think that the businesses that do survive will be more, operationally efficient and also be more sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree. That's also kind of a tone that I got from talking to a couple of VCs on the show, that exactly said that, right? So it's like it's almost like a cleansing process that, economy currently goes through, which is not always a bad thing. So I guess maybe what would be also interesting for me and also the audience is, what was the most clicked or the most popular piece or a piece of news that you wrote or the magazine wrote that was most, got the most attention? Like, are there any specific stories that usually get more attention than others, or was it something very topical that really hit people's attention? Maybe you can give us some background on that.
Yeah, so we actually did an article that was like the top 10 read stories on Sifted last year. And the top one was on digital nomads, because my colleague and I did a reporting trip to Madeira, not last year, but the year before. And during COVID, there had been this digital nomad village, which had been created essentially to help people settle on this island. And it was a really interesting reporting trip because it was looking at, okay, remote work is now, liberated people to live wherever they want and all that kind of thing. But what are the societal and environmental implications of this? So we saw in the news last week as well that people in Lisbon are now protesting because they're saying, the government has attracted too many tourists and too many remote workers, and they're not putting enough money into infrastructure. And probably we're going to see it more in Berlin as well, because there's always this tension between trying to attract. There's always this tension between trying to attract foreign money and foreign talent, while the locals are kind of saying, well, actually, what is left for us?
They're staying behind, yeah, totally.
Exactly. So I think digital nomadism is something that Sifted readers just love. And every time we put a piece out on digital nomads, that gets the most clicks.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting concept. And also, I was in the summer in Lisbon for a wedding, actually. And I spoke to a couple of people there that actually live there and they were originally from France. And they said the lifestyle is great. Everything is cheaper, obviously. But then again, also when you think about the locals, they have much lower salaries. They don't get the flat anymore in the center. So there is also a political element around it, which I think is very fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, money is also something that everybody loves reading about, right? Like the second piece that was the most clicked on was about VC salaries in Germany.
Yeah, of course. The Germans don't like. Exactly. Yeah, especially in Germany, people don't really like talking about money too much, but obviously everyone wants to know. Cool. Okay, so maybe let's talk a little bit about the VC and startup ecosystem specifically. So you are from the UK originally, but how do you perceive, Berlin as a startup ecosystem, and what do you think makes the city actually that successful to attract founders from all over the globe?
I think Berlin is a place where you can meet really interesting people. I think there is a kind of openness to the city which you don't have in other places. Even having come from the UK to Germany, it was quite a culture shock in the sense of like how people behave. Everybody behaves with this kind of openness that perhaps other cultures don't necessarily have. So I think as a city, it attracts quite diverse and interesting people. I think as well, like a lot of it is to do with the price of the city, even though it's getting, more expensive. Comparatively, Berlin is still fairly cheap, and you still can have like a high quality of life living in this city for less money than you would in, like, I don't know, London or Paris or whatever. So that's definitely a factor.
Absolutely.
But there's so much the city has to offer. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been living here for 5 years, and I can definitely imagine myself staying another couple of years at least, just because there's so much to do and there's so much opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an abundance of things that you can do. Like your free time, perceived free time value is quite high. And also what I noted when I moved, I used to live in London actually for a couple of years, and I was an investment banker. So I would say I had like a decent lifestyle, right? But yet my lifestyle entirely upgraded just because the living costs are so much cheaper here. So with the money that I got from the job, I could actually out of a sudden have like a double as good lifestyle, which was amazing, So I really do understand that people want to move here, also for that reason.
Yeah, definitely. But I do think that there are problems, as with any city, but particularly when it comes to moving here as a foreigner, there are a lot of barriers. And I think, Germany knows this and they're trying to make things a bit easier, but there are a lot of very heavily bureaucratic processes which make it very difficult to settle in Berlin. And a lot of entrepreneurs and these kind of unicorn founders in Germany are very outspoken about this, because also as a company, when it comes to hiring talent, it's very difficult because of these kind of rules and regulations that are surrounding it. I mean, even now, you have to sign an employment contract with a wet ink and then scan it and send it back.
Yeah.
So I'm doing that myself this week. And I said to my boyfriend, I was like, I can't remember the last time I had to physically sign something and scan it back, So
yeah, and
it's these little things on a daily basis make running a business in Germany very difficult.
Yeah, the bureaucracy is quite high. It's true, and we're kind of behind. I mean, I think Estonia, I think it was Estonia. They're quite far ahead in terms of like digitalization of these processes. But yeah, let's see. Maybe let's talk about, because I know that your background is a lot in kind of the organizational side of things and remote work and hiring compensation. So as we've seen, when we already touched upon this in the introduction a little bit, we've seen quite a few tech companies laying off significant numbers of staff. Are you seeing any specific trends, or is there something that you wanna name here in terms of these kind of layoffs happening now? Are there good practices? Are there bad practices? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to look at it from like a company stage perspective. So last year, it very much seemed that it was the big tech companies and then also these like later stage companies that were doing big layoffs. And VCs were saying, this is largely to do with the fact that these companies had excess money. They were hiring a lot, which is obviously a growth metric, but they were hiring very unnecessarily. So that's why maybe you saw bigger layoffs at these like later stage companies that were better capitalized. But now we're seeing this kind of creep into early stage as well. And in Berlin last week, we saw Clue, one of the femtech companies, they laid off a quarter of their workforce, which, knowing the company very well, I think was very difficult for them. They've handled it very well, from what I'm hearing from employees. They sent. They called everybody individually that was being laid off and told them the decision and explained and said, my door is open if you want any questions. And then they did like an all hands meeting so that everybody could kind of ask. Because also for the employees left behind, right? That's also,
of course,
scary, because then you're thinking, is my job going to be on the line? So in terms of best practice, that seems, the best way to do it is to call people individually and let them know, rather than sending like a company-wide email.
like a Twitter, right?
Which I understand is also kind of a capacity thing, right? Like if you've got an organization of thousands of employees, it's going to be very hard to, call everybody individually. But I think there are ways of doing it that is a bit more personal and a bit more kind of, thank you for your time, kind of.
Yeah, respectful, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think I think one of the biggest things we're going to see now is that early stage companies are now going to have that wave of layoffs, unfortunately. In general, I think recruiting is definitely on pause. There are some exceptions to that, of course, but I think recruiting is taking a lot longer and companies are hesitating a lot. So whereas in 2021, you could probably apply for a company and get a job within a couple of weeks, I think now that time frame is being extended to a couple of months.
Do you also think that the salaries will go down? Because what I noted a little bit, just being here in the ecosystem, like salaries went through the roof for if you had like a certain skill set and you were working in the startup ecosystem, like because companies wanted to hire so badly, like the salaries went crazy. Do you think this trend will now reverse a little bit?
It's a really interesting question. I think one of the things is that with big tech laying off so many people, it was kind of big tech, I think, that actually pushed a lot of these salaries up because, you had like mid-stage companies that are thinking like, well, I can't compete with Google or whatever. So they were still trying to kind of like push the salaries up a bit. But now with these tech companies laying off so many people, it's kind of removing that dynamic from the market. And I think you'll find that earlier stage companies are now going to be in with a shot of getting, these kind of big tech profiles or later stage, more experienced profiles. And that's something we're trying to track at the moment, actually. It's like, where are all these people from big companies going?
Exactly.
Are they going into startups? And we know that anecdotally, but there's not any data yet because everything's still in flux. But yeah, it's a very, very difficult thing to track. But we're seeing people, going into climate. We're seeing people from fintech startups going back to incumbents. So there's lots of like interesting reshuffling going on. But we'll probably have to wait until the end of the year to really see, when everything's kind of settled.
Yeah. My prediction is a little bit, but that's just like a gut feeling that a lot of people that had good salary jobs and they will not find something equivalent that they might actually found themselves, right? Because then it's like an investment in yourself. And I don't know, that's just like a prediction that I had, but maybe I might be wrong. Interesting to see.
No, I think that's actually a really good point. And I spoke to someone recently who's founded an organization called Uniborn. And it's very much based on this idea that, he thinks, the guy that founded it, a guy called Dimitri, he thinks that we're going to see a lot of former operators founding businesses. He's now made this it's like an investment vehicle, but they're also going to, offer like advice and like support in other ways as well. But he is very much kind of like, we're going to see so many more companies being founded. And in this other piece that I did on the kind of German predictions for 2023, lots of people were saying there's going to be a lot more businesses, but we'll see because things are tough, right? If you've got money in the bank, then sure, maybe it's okay. But for first-time founders, I think it's going to be quite difficult.
True. And actually, that's a perfect transition to my next question because you already touched upon your article that you wrote about 2023 predictions in the German tech market. So maybe can you give us a little bit of a summary what this article was about and what are kind of the predictions for the next year, or actually for this year, in terms of German tech?
Yeah, so I asked just like 10 people within the ecosystem, the German ecosystem, what they think is going to happen this year. And I tried to kind of spread it out so that there are people from different sectors kind of speculating about what's going to happen. But yeah, as I said, one of the biggest predictions was that there's going to be a massive wave of people founding businesses. Some VCs said that, they think there's going to be kind of fewer rounds and that investors are going to be focusing a lot on businesses that have good business models, good unit economics, sustainable runway. Climate tech was also another thing that people said is going to continue being huge. And the data shows that to be true as well. And then, of course, ChatGPT, which everybody is talking about. People were saying that, this is going to kind of birth a host of new startups this year. But I'm kind of speculative about that because I think the technology has a lot of problems, but it's definitely kind of like in vogue at the moment, right?
Yeah, for sure. No, I read a lot about it as well. And it's like people are saying there will be a whole wave of companies like GPT or OpenAI for, back in the days, maybe like, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, it was like Uber for something, you would take like that business model that kind of worked and then put it for some other context. So I think, I don't know, let's see, but I think that could be an interesting one. A lot of AI run businesses.
Yeah, definitely. It's just funny because people are talking about it so much just in public. I noticed over the weekend, I was in a sauna on Sunday. And my friend next to me was just like, they're talking about ChatGPT yesterday, and then people on the next table were talking about it, and I was just like, oh my God.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I also sometimes I don't know if it's actually that much, because obviously my LinkedIn feed always shows you what you are liking, what you're reading, and then obviously my whole feed is full of OpenAI. But I don't know if that's everyone's reality, but let's see. Okay, moving on. So we talked a little bit about the early stage in Berlin scene, but now we want to move a little bit more towards the late stage, because this is really also a big part of our audience is more like late stage companies that are perhaps looking to IPO at one point, or even companies that are already listed, because we have this investor relations piece as part of our audience. So I saw with much curiosity that you actually wrote a piece about Personio, and you actually interviewed the founder Hanno, and CEO and founder Hanno. And maybe you can give us a bit of a background. What was the key message of the piece? What the thoughts are on their journey? Take it away.
Yeah, so it was interesting. So I covered Personio last year when they last raised money. I think it was in June or something. And I asked Hanno about the possibility of IPO. And he was saying, no, definitely not for another couple of years. But the step that they've just made, which I'll explain in a minute, is definitely a kind of signal that IPO is on the cards. Maybe not now, but at least in the next couple of years. But Personio is transitioning to become an SE company, like I'm going to murder the pronunciation of it, but it's a Societas Europea, I think is how you say it.
Yeah.
Which essentially allows businesses to carry out their activities like more easily over member states. So I think it's the idea of having one single European entity, which you can run all your subsidiary kind of businesses in different countries, rather than having like a different legal framework for every country. But it also lays the ground for an IPO at a later stage. So lots of companies do seem to be transitioning to this SE before they IPO. So Celonis, I think, is an SE. And then N26 also wants to transition to become an SE ahead of their IPO. But I think for Hanno, transitioning to an SE has also like a symbolic significance. Because Personio is a European company. You know, they're not just operating in Germany anymore. They have employees and customers all over Europe. So the SE is very much like a European brand. So I think it's also kind of like a brand image kind of thing, becoming like a European corporation rather than a German corporation, essentially. And in terms of the IPO as well, Hanno did say that the earliest would be the end of 2024. And that his preference would be to IPO in Germany, but it depends on whether the conditions by then are a bit easier.
Right. Okay. That's super interesting. It's obviously always like a tricky topic, right, to talk about. I mean, you don't want to say too much because it's a quite like also regulated space, right? So if it's more like, okay, it's somewhere in the future, you can somewhat say, but you can also not obviously give more concrete answers because it's again, it's very like legally in regulated space. But yeah, I do see that as well a lot, that companies, especially those that are operating internationally, are transforming into an SE legal form, which underpins really also the story of being an international company, recruiting international talent, operating internationally. So I think that really fits the story, but it's super interesting to put it into that specific context of this stage of their company. Maybe that also moves us to the next question. Which other potential, I mean, this is always rumors, right? There's no one will say we for sure will do an IPO unless there's like this official statement, which is called ITF, which actually Ionos last week announced. So they are actually officially doing an IPO. But usually otherwise, other than that, it's usually rumors. But have you heard of any other scale-ups that are still private, that are kind of rumored or talked about to IPO at one point?
Yeah, so I mentioned Celonis just then, and I think from speaking to VCs, they think that there could be an IPO situation for them at the earliest, again, in about 18 months' time. I heard that NPAL is a contender for an IPO soon.
Interesting.
And Babbel, this language learning app, they actually told me last week, because they were actually meant to IPO last year, I believe, but then the markets changed and I think they cancelled. But they still very much want to IPO, I think, in the future. And outside of Germany, I'm not entirely sure. I heard that Cabify, this Spanish multi-mobility company, could also be thinking of an IPO at some point. But yeah, as you said, it's always kind of speculation, right? And companies don't really want to admit it, just in case it doesn't.
Exactly. Yeah, that's always a tricky part also from a communication, right? I mean, once you are really in the process, you, first of all, are not really allowed to talk about it until you are issuing this ITF document or this press release. And then secondly, and that's actually what happened with Bubble, right? I think they were already out officially, and then the market kind of turned, which can happen, right? It's not really sometimes in your control, but then it's like very hard to trace back. So I think that's why companies are rather hesitant to talk about this very openly. But yeah, it's obviously a super interesting piece of information. And yeah, good to know. Maybe just one last piece on late stage, like what do you hear, what sort of other considerations from founders in Germany in terms of a listing in Germany? So I think it's always great to hear if companies like maybe Personio do want to get listed in Germany. Is there any considerations, any discussions that you're recalling? What are kind of the considerations?
I think, as you mentioned earlier, it's like a very complex regulatory environment, right? So often you don't hear the specifics, you just hear like the regulation part of it. Kind of sucks. But from speaking to Hanno, he did say that it's not as easy to list in Germany as it might be in the US, for instance, because there's a lot of regulatory hurdles, and the market for IPOs in Germany is actually generally smaller and a lot more selective when it comes to IPOs. But I hear as well that traditionally companies would only list in Germany if they were profitable. And we know, right, that most tech companies aren't profitable. I think we did a piece in October last year, and we could count 3 companies in Europe that were, unicorn and profitable. So perhaps part of the problem here is this German mentality, which is maybe not as growth-minded as the US or kind of other places. And this is just what I hear from founders when it comes to all sorts of things, as we talked about earlier with the employment stuff and the talent acquisition. And, there's a lot that Germany could be doing to be perhaps a little bit less risk averse and maybe a bit more kind of, have this like growth mindset.
Yeah. I mean, me having worked for 2 actually listed tech companies, one was Delivery Hero and one was About You, and I was kind of in charge of their kind of investor relations functions. It was definitely sometimes tricky, especially with like, in a German setup, sort of like if you're not profitable, it's definitely still tricky. But then again, I mean, all of the tech companies that are high growth are, usually not profitable. But I think especially now in current markets, they are actually being penalized and even more, right? So if we're looking at all the tech stocks that are, especially those that are not profitable, obviously being penalized more. But yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I'm not sure if it's different in the US, but I think they just have a different growth mindset there, which helps to underpin like these tech companies from going there.
Yeah,
Very cool.
I don't know how it is elsewhere in Europe, but
yeah, I wouldn't know either. I think Germany's pretty much in line with the European mindset there. I think there's maybe just a distinction between the US and Europe. Curious to hear how it would be in the UK. Actually, I don't have any concrete comparison, but that would be something I will have to look up. So we do want to actually leave our audience with one final tip, because obviously you are working for a news outlet, and some founders do want to get their story into news outlets, and Sifted is obviously a great one to be published in. But how would you, like, maybe to give like some concrete steps, how can founders go about getting into press, or specifically into Sifted in that case?
I think that's something that we see a lot, is that founders think the only way you can get into a publication is by having a funding round and announcing that funding round. But I have to say that at Sifted, that's probably not the best way. We want to see founders that are offering opinions about things. So one of the best ways to get our attention, I would say, is, if we've written something, then get in touch with us and say, like, I think X, Y, and Z. Or even like posting on LinkedIn, I find a lot of my interviewees just by people having posted something on LinkedIn or commenting on something that I've posted. So it's kind of about putting yourself out there and being a bit of a, I hate this term, but like a thought leader, like offering some kind of expertise and some kind of point of view is probably the better way of getting a journalist's attention, rather than saying like, here's my funding round, can you cover it?
Okay. Yeah. So it's actually more building up the relationship up front and, putting yourself out there as opposed to just being there when you kind of want to be published.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, our inbox gets thousands of emails per day. So also when pitching, I think it's really important to be as concise as possible. So instead of sending like a really, really long email, think about what the point is of the story that you're pitching, and try and think like a journalist a bit and be like, what would the headline be? And what would be the 3 main points? And, have like a good subject line as well, for instance, because that kind of thing, if a journalist is working on a piece and they see like a subheading, then that's going to grab their attention. And if it's a bit more condensed, what you're telling them, then they're probably more likely to come back to you very quickly, rather than sending like a very long kind of press release about something.
That's super interesting. Thank you so much, Miriam. We actually came to the end of our interview. And honestly, that was a super interesting chat, and a lot of questions I actually added without you knowing, because there was just too much to talk about. So thank you so much again, and we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me again, and see you soon.
Bye.
So, wir sind jetzt auch schon wieder am Ende des Podcasts angekommen. Ich hoffe, dir hat diese Episode gefallen. Wenn du Hilfe brauchst bei irgendwelchen Kapitalmarktthemen oder digitalen Investor Relations Themen, dann melde dich gerne unter unicornconsulting.com und buch dir einen ersten freien Consulting Call. Wir würden uns ebenfalls darüber freuen, wenn du uns auf Social Media folgst, zum Beispiel YouTube, TikTok, Instagram oder auch LinkedIn, oder wenn du einfach einen Like da lässt. Ich wünsche euch alles Gute und bis zum nächsten Mal. Eure Julia. Ciao.